afternoon. Like Enrico before me, I would like to use the opportunity to thank you all for the experiences of the past few days. It's been my first time in Asia, and I very much enjoyed it. And I thank you for your patience with my many questions about life in the Philippines, in Asia more in general, about history, about food, about daily life. I learned a lot from you, and I look forward to this last section, opportunity for conversation, and maybe conversations to follow, hopefully. My thanks to Danny for the invitation are a little bit more ambivalent, I have to say, because the task for this short paper that he posed us is a difficult one. In his invitation to participate in this panel, Danny asked us to re-envision some future directions for theology as it encounters the challenges of Asian Christianities. Nothing else. This is a tall order that calls for a series of disclaimers about my personal limitations and the limitations of this paper right away. I don't feel quite capable to see the future of all of theology in my little crystal ball. So I will limit myself to sketching some ideas about possible future developments in aesthetic theology, one of my research interests, which I think could be helpful when talking about the future of theology more in general. And I will also admit that I had my first in-depth encounter with Asian Christianities in preparing for this conference and meeting you all here. And thus I'm really ill-equipped to comment on the challenges you all face. With as little as I know about Asia, I do know that much, though, that it's quite insufficient to try to speak about Asian culture in the singular. Reaching from India to Southeast Asia, Korea, Japan, China, Asian cultures are so much more and so much richer than I can capture here. As a German working in the US, I'm one of the people I'll be speaking about, who are caught up in a Western conceptual and cultural context, and frankly are missing out on a lot, as I've realized when I prepared for this paper and met you here. I'm grateful for the challenge Danny posed to me, but I also know that I won't be able to live up to it. So given these limitations, my paper and its sources are by necessity eclectic. I have followed my informed intuition and will draw on what resonated somehow with my own research interests and aesthetic sensibilities, what sparked my interest, spoke to me, and what left me bewildered. And that also guided a little bit the selection of images that you'll be seeing in my PowerPoint. I will argue here that aesthetic theology can provide a space for encounter with a culturally and religious other that is a promising and necessary direction for theologies across the globe, and maybe especially for Asian theologies that are characterized by a great internal diversity. So the precondition for allowing aesthetic theology to be a space for encounter is the further development of aesthetic theology as a mode of doing theology that includes the whole person in her material existence and relationships, and that broadens the notion of theological knowing beyond the rational to include ways of knowing that emerge from embodied, sensory, and affective experiences. With these ideas, I'm not starting ex nihilo, but I'm building on ongoing movements and shifts. Reference points are, in particular, liberation, feminist, post-colonial, and comparative theologies, with their turn towards popular piety, embodiment, and creative forms as sources of a living theology. So let me begin to speak about aesthetic theology as aesthetic theology. The theological reflection on the aesthetic has, for the most part, been an intellectual exercise abstracted from the actual sensory experience it aimed to elucidate. Aesthesis, Greek for concrete, sensory, embodied experiences, has been lost in speculative philosophizing. Conceptually, Aesthetic theology has been rooted in the European tradition of the philosophical discipline of aesthetics, dominated by male academics, and mostly concerned with what one might call high culture. Recent shifts towards popular culture, especially forms of popular religion in liberation theological aesthetics, for example by Roberto Goizueta and Alejandro Garcia Rivera, are thus very welcome, but they too remain situated on a philosophical level of disembodied abstraction that contradicts their claims of wanting to pay attention to the theological meaning of concrete, embodied experience. Consequently, I would argue that a shift in aesthetic theology to the aesthetic is necessary in the future, a turn to the senses, and the inclusion of a broader range of material. The benefits will be a greater awareness for the situatedness of theological reflection, the confluence of aesthetics and ethics in the commitment to empowerment and liberation, and the opening up to diversity and inclusivity in our God talk. Let me pass this out a little bit. Art historian David Friedberg points out that sensual reactions to artworks have been excluded systematically from secular and as well theological aesthetic theories, as if they were proof that a work of art that arouses such reactions cannot be real art. However, Friedberg underlines the necessity to integrate the body in the analysis of reception in order to be able to understand the immediate and intense impact of artworks and their significance for us. Attention to how we make sense through our senses is grounded in the phenomenological insight that our bodies are the necessary basis for our relation to the world and the construction of our image of it. Maurice Merleau-Ponty's description of the human body as a being of two leaves that exists both as the subject of perception and as its object is fundamental in this regard. Knowledge does not emerge from disembodied, purely rational processes, but is grounded in the bodily constitution of human beings and in their sensory experiences, among which the experience of art is a concentrated moment of focused attention. This embodied knowledge is both inward and outward oriented. In the sensory experience, I feel myself feeling, and thus am centered in myself, and at the same time, I moved outside of myself into the relationship with the artwork, with my environment and other human beings towards which I am oriented as a sentient being. Thus, I think it is not a stretch to consider aesthetic experiences as incarnational and sacramental, in that they root us in the goodness of creation, our created bodies, and at the same time help us unfold into right relationships with others. While I do think that the experience of art is special in its intentional and intense evocation of sensory reactions, attention to the aesthetic will by necessity force us to also consider other sensory experiences that are a part of our day-to-day life and relationships. Thus, the aesthetic theology of the future will have to expand its horizon with regard to the material on which it reflects, not just the high culture of Europe and North America, and not just the aesthetics of seeing in particular and hearing to a degree, but also the elegance of dance and the exertions of sports, the taste of mangoes and the smell of rain, the texture of tree bark or soft linen, experiences of both the natural and created world that we normally don't pay much attention to, and that are nevertheless a daily attunement to the environment we live in and the bodies as which we are created. Expanding our scope beyond the extraordinary aesthetic experiences of art, often reserved for an elite that can afford the museum and opera tickets, forces attention on the everyday, lo quotidiano of liberation theology. Ordinary, embodied experiences of joy and pleasure, pain and suffering. Liberation theological aesthetics has begun this reflection, but we need to consider more concretely the whole breadth of everyday aesthetic experiences. The sacramental value of the material as created by God for the good of all human beings, The goodness of our bodies themselves as part of our being image of God is our daily experience, rather than an exception, something to consider more deeply through aesthetic theology. I want to briefly touch on 3 consequences of such a further development of aesthetic theology. First, it will be situated, and thus aware of its limitations, non-universalistic and communal. It is a theology that emerges from concrete embodied experiences in a concrete space. A theology, thus, that concerns the people, individuals and communities immediately. Second, aesthetic theology is also a theology that is committed, engaged and empowering. If the everyday experiences of the people are given central importance, that means they are the subject of theological reflection. Their experiences are its source. That also means that experiences of suffering have to be tackled as ones that are not meant to be, and that experiences of joy cannot be dismissed as escapism. The measure of beauty is human flourishing, as Laurie Cassidy and Maureen O'Connell say. Thus, aesthetic theology is ethical praxis as well as theological reflection. And third, aesthetic theology opens up the space for global, intercultural and interreligious encounter and conversation. Garcia Rivera has shown how the early mission in Latin America drew on symbols and the aesthetic dimension to enable communication with indigenous peoples and their religious traditions. I think the aesthetic can provide a space for encounter with the other that both allows to bridge gaps of cultural understanding without denying the uniqueness of the other, and thus allows for openness, diversity and inclusivity in our theological conversations. In these reflections about aesthetic theology as a future direction of theology, I see from my very limited vantage point various connections with Asian theologies and aesthetics that could push this development even further. The most fundamental is the fact that a holistic worldview seems to be more mainstream in Asia than in Europe. Especially at the level of Asian popular traditions, the unity of feeling and knowing, body and mind, the natural and supernatural, and a more synthetic than analytical form of reflection seems to be more pronounced and more normal than in Western traditions. The separation of experience and understanding that Western aesthetic theology has to laboriously overcome is not so much an issue in this worldview, which thus offers a very different point of departure for reflections on the possibility to encounter the divine in the scent or taste of daily life. A closer look at Asian aesthetic theories provides other interesting connections worth pursuing further. I will just briefly mention a few. For example, I'm thinking of the emphasis on the now and the everydayness of aesthetic experience in Japanese aesthetics, and the idea that a viewer establishes a relation of sympathy with what is represented, or the close connection between the aesthetic and the ethical, between cognition and intuition in Chinese aesthetics, or the non-dualism and nothingness expressed in white, the central color of Korean aesthetics, which transcends all representation, or the religious respect for matter and the natural world that results from indigenous influences in Southeast Asia, or the Indian theory of rasa, emotional states evoked by aesthetic experiences that has already provided, in the art and theology of Jyoti Sahi and the Hindu-Christian comparative theological project, a fruitful point of encounter. Or more broadly, the hybridity noticeable in several Asian aesthetic traditions, which define their particularity precisely through their capacity to integrate various cultural impulses, as in Korean, Japanese, or Southeast Asian aesthetics. All of these, it seems to me, are inspirations that have not yet been fully explored for their theological potential. In a way, many Asian theological approaches already are a form of aesthetic theology, in that popular practices and movements, with their on-the-ground, everyday embodied experiences, are considered to be theologically productive, and aesthetics aesthetic forms such as poems, songs, dance, or images are readily used as sources of theological reflection, as we have seen in the liturgies and presentations of this conference as well. So let me conclude, and I have to jump a couple of slides here. Let me conclude with some thoughts about the future of aesthetic theology and theology as aesthetic in a situation of cultural and religious encounters. First, I'd like to underline the importance of attention to embodiment and its consequences. We are not just hearers of the word, as Karl Rahner famously said, but seers of the empty tomb. We touch the side wound, we anoint Jesus' hair, we taste his body. Our encounters with the divine are embodied and sensory, and thus theological reflection has to attend to these experiences, both in their focused evocation in the reception of art and in their everyday occurrences. Theology is thus quite fundamentally an aesthetic theology that emerges from and reflects upon the embodied experience of the transcendent. Second, this attention to concrete experiences will help to draw out the ethic implications of the aesthetic. Experiences of aesthetic pleasure do not have to shut us off from the suffering of others, but rather make us attentive to it. They motivate us to imagine a world of beauty and flourishing and work towards realizing it. Third, I believe that aesthetic theology will be a theology not only of theologians, but of all those who feel, taste, smell God, reflect on their experiences, and wish to share them with others. This means the theology of the future should not be a theology of academia only, but include many voices from many walks of life. If aesthetic experience is, then, central to this theology, it will also be done in other forms and scholarly articles. It may be danced, or weaved, or cooked. And fourth, it will be a theology of encounter through shared beauty and wonder. There is something universal to sensory experiences that does not deny the cultural formation of the senses and how we understand what we sense. Creative imagination that emerges out of sensory experiences allows to cross a space to the other without denying the fact that there is something to be crossed. The individual and cultural particularity of sensory experiences, their focus on the specific, does not lend itself to grand universal schemes, but to careful, situated, modest proposals. And yet, it is not limited to the already known, but imaginatively open to new experiences and ideas. Like a good meal makes us curious to taste another dish. However, in order to become such an embodied theology of encounter, aesthetic theology and theology more broadly will have to develop strategies to avoid exoticism, superficiality, and exploitation, trying to find a balance between shared aesthetic appreciation and surprised bewilderment. Simply using poems or images from different cultural contexts or walks of life does not make for better theology if we don't know how to sense their wisdoms and make sense of them. In a very small way, I have experienced aesthetic theology as a beautiful, bewildering, and challenging encounter with Asian Christianities in my preparations for this talk. I know that I have made only a first, if important, step in reacting to my attraction, to my aesthetic experience of some of the images I've shared with you. More study, reflection, and encounters will have to follow. And I look forward to our conversation as an opportunity for that. Thank you.